WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We were positively up all night on Thursday. That won't stop us from getting out and doing the Maryland Crab Cake Tour presented by the Maryland Lottery. Let yourself play. I got my mask here, my lottery mask. I've been wearing this a little bit around. It's actually comfortable when I wear it. We'll not be wearing it at Nick's Grandstand Grill. We're going out Fresco. We're going to be out at Timonium. We're going to be at Coco's back in the city on Wednesday with our mayor, Brandon Scott, as well as with Senator Corey McRae. Some friends from Coppin. I think Mike Rosigliano is going to stop by because we're in his neighborhood over in Lauraville. And it was not a good news final on Thursday night. Luke Jones joins us now. He'll be out in Owings Mills all week getting you prepared for Chicago, Illinois, and as long as my back holds up, thank you, Dr. Steve, I will be going to Chicago next weekend. I would say John Harbaugh's probably happy I was not in the post-game press conference on Thursday night, Luke. I remember having a really salty post-game press conference with Coach Billick there during the monsoon 22 years ago. I asked him something flippant. He looked down at me. He's like, it's a good thing you're the one asking that question. I'll answer it. It was like one of those, oh, okay. Harbaugh tends to be chippy in general in this. The post-game was more of leadership falling on sword. You and I have talked about how bad it was on both sides of the ball. I mean, even Tucker missed a field goal to add to the hijinks down in Miami Gardens. But coaching, leadership, Harbaugh, bringing it together. I would think John Harbaugh's taking this loss hard because I haven't seen him conduct himself in a post-game podium quite like that.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen John after a loss just not have much to say, period, and, give you very short answers. But this was a much more, we just weren't ready. That's on me. We were out-coached. It did not want to put much on the players. And look, I mean, that's you have a game like that and you have a defensive approach that completely stifles you, even though you say that you were prepared for it and didn't have a good plan for it. That is on coaching then. If players are saying that, we expected them to do that and we just didn't handle it, that is on coaching. Now, to be very clear, that's not to absolve the players on the field, but for John to take the approach that he did in the postgame and to be, I mean, as reflective as you can be 12 minutes after the game ends. I mean, we talk about, in some ways the silliness of the post-game, immediate post-game press conference rather than talking the next day, 2 days later, whatever it is. But it was very clear that
we're all in processing mode in a post-game. Like you and I are there processing what questions we're going to ask to some degree. They're just walking off the field. But when you take an ass kicking like that, this is a long weekend for the coaching staff because they look shocked.
Yeah, well, they played like they were shocked. I mean, like I said, going back to our previous conversation, if you lose like this to an AFC North team or to a team that's 4-4, let's say 5-4, 4-5, something like that at this stage of the season, you're still ticked off about it. But that's where I'm a little more inclined to chalk it up to the Thursday thing, the short week thing. But I mean, this is not a Miami Dolphins team that has been at all good this year. I mean, I know I was joking in the media room earlier in the week with some other reporters, not even trying to be disrespectful, but just saying, boy, you look at this Dolphins team and how they profile. All right, they're not awful stopping the run. There are a couple other things here and there that they weren't terrible at doing. But, I mean, they were 30th in total offense. They were 30th in total defense. They were 28th in points per game. They were 27th in points per game allowed. I mean, there's just not – they weren't very good in special teams. I mean, go down the list. There just weren't many factors that you could really point to and say, yeah, you really need to watch out for this. In fact, one of the few things I would have said, and I noted this in some of my thoughts at BaltimorePositive.com going into the game, would have been to watch out for Mike Gesicki, and the Ravens did a great job shutting him down. I mean, he wasn't even a factor for, we saw Marlon Humphrey break up a couple passes going his way, traveled with him in some of those third down situations. So, that would have been one of the factors that I pointed to and said, if there's a formula for the Dolphins to somehow win this game or to be in this game in the fourth quarter, I'm guessing Mike Gesicki, in the same way that we saw Darren Waller and Travis Kelce and some other tight, CJ Uzama for Cincinnati, a tight end having a big night. They did a great job against him. Now, the other tight ends caught a couple passes, so they weren't perfect in that regard, but it really does speak to just how shocking this was from the standpoint of, this is a bad team, and that's why I said this is on the short list of the worst losses of the John Harbaugh era. I mean, it's, you lose games. I mean, we understand that. I mean, this team wasn't going to go, they weren't going to run the table and finish 15-2. At least I wasn't expecting that. But to lose in this fashion to that kind of football team on the heels of some of these performances where they've had to pull a rabbit out of their hat, it's where you do, as I said, you kind of have to go back and look at process on both sides of the ball and the way that they've played over the course of 60 minutes, not looking at the final score and just saying, okay, it's a win, no problem. A win is a win, move on. But if you're trying to get better as a football team, as a coaching staff, as players, seeing some of their deficiencies and then seeing that play out against, let's face it, let's call it what it is, very much an inferior opponent, that's concerning. And to your point, it leads to a very long, mini bye, whatever you want to call it, for this coaching staff. The players will get away. And I think, from a fan perspective, one of the things that I think can sometimes be a little difficult to understand is players are quite good at, treating it like it's their livelihood, like it's their job. And then when the game's over, they do move on and, they're going to enjoy their weekend. Coaches, they got a lot of work to do and there's a lot to clean up. And this team has to figure out a way to start faster on offense. They have to figure out a way to eliminate some of these big plays on defense. I mean, that was a really good defensive performance for large stretches of that game, but it's completely ruined when you give up a big, busted coverage, a big play. You miss a tackle in a key spot, and they've done that way too often. That's why they've been a bottom 10 defense compared to being let's say a top 12 defense, as they've profiled it pretty well in certain areas. So got a lot of work to work on, and they've got a little bit of time here, but as we said, the schedule really picks up big time after the Chicago game. But when you lose a game like this, none of these games are gimmies anymore, and you're really at a point now which, let's face it, the Ravens hadn't really been in the Lamar Jackson era, where you're going into these games and you don't know exactly what to expect from the Ravens. I mean, they've been so good from the moment Lamar Jackson took over midway 2018, but this is very much a team now where, the Forrest Gump line, a box of chocolates, you don't know exactly what you're going to get week to week.
Well, the praise for the offensive line, and it's amazing when you watch these games on TV after never watching them my whole life, right? Like the last year and a half, I've watched more Ravens football on TV. When they play like that on Thursday night, I do lament that we didn't get any Cuban food out of this gig. I'm a little pissed about that. But if anybody wants to mule me back, if you got friends and relatives, I would appreciate that. But I look at that effort and I say on offense and the offensive line and what they were trying to do, right? And what the Dolphins weren't letting them do. And then it comes down to, can you throw the football better? Protection. I don't know any part of the game on Thursday. Now, I was thinking about this in the fourth quarter, like because of the Superman act we talked about before. If they win the game, what did they do well? What are they going to look at and say, we did well? And they wound up, it went the other way when they wind up not covering the wide receiver out on the top of the screen. I look at it and say the offensive line continues to be, they can praise it. Troy Aikman can praise all they want. This isn't what we saw 2 years ago. And I know Marshall Yonda's not coming back and Ronnie Stanley's not coming back. But to me, if your offensive line is dominant every week, you'll run the football, especially with this quarterback in this style of offense. He's gotten better. They've gotten better. To me, it comes back to the O-line, and it comes back to having running backs that are less than Gus Edwards, less than Mark Ingram 2 years ago, less than what the perception of J.K. Dobbins' ceiling would be. They're playing with diminished football players, Luke, and I can say that because I'm eating Wise pumpkin ice cream. We're halfway into the season onto the other side. This is what happens when you're halfway through the season and you don't have your $150 million tackle. For the same reason when he went down last year, I looked at my wife and said they can't win the Super Bowl without him. We're a year later into this. I'm wondering if they can win a Super Bowl with Alejandro Villanueva and the cast of merry men that they have there, because it's not a plus offensive line. It really isn't. There's nothing. There's no Hall of Famers. There's nothing special that sticks out about it. The special thing that sticks out about it's the big number 8 that that takes the snaps, and everything else about it. I don't want to say pedestrian, but no different than what anybody else has, or in many cases inferior to what other people have.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I mean, even one of the few bright spots of the offensive line to me has been Bradley Bozeman. Snaps were not very good on Thursday night. I mean, that's something that maybe not as disastrous as we saw at times last year, whether it was Matt Skura or Patrick McCary at the center position, but a few shaky snaps on Thursday night where that just, even if it's not a fumble, it disrupts your timing and it disrupts the rhythm of the play when your quarterback has to reach for the ball and it's not where it needs to be. But you're absolutely right. And again, this goes back to what you just said, that where would this team be without Lamar Jackson playing at a high level in some of their victories? I mean, if they have, and Lamar wasn't good on Thursday night. Let's be clear. I mean, this wasn't all the offensive line. They just played poorly across the board, and he did not play well. But it does speak to when you don't get the best version of Lamar Jackson, this team really struggles to try to win football games. And it speaks to if they only had, and I'm not saying the worst quarterback in the league, but let's say they had kind of a league average starting quarterback, what would this team be right now? 2-7, 3-6? Maybe, some miracle you're 4-5.
If Tyrod Taylor were their quarterback, or
he's
RG3 washed up, or if they had to play with anybody but him, if Huntley had to come in and play 6 games, they would go 2-4 or 1-5, right? I mean, they would.
But I'm saying even better than that. Give me an average starting, someone you think is an average starting quarterback in the league. I'm not sure they have more than 2 wins. I'm not sure they have more than 3 wins. I think that's where they would be. And it goes back to what I said about how this offense is flawed and how this defense has given up way too many big plays, and it's just killed them. So, bringing it back to the offensive line, as you're talking about, I think even the game plan, and this goes back to Harbaugh talking about, they were out coached, but the game plan that we saw and the amount of cover zero and secondary blitzes that the Dolphins used begged for them to take some shots down the field. But it was very clear the way they called that game and the way that Lamar operated, they didn't have the confidence in their offensive line holding up whatsoever. I mean, there were a couple situations they went to empty. It did not look good. And it's kind of wild. I mean, I think back to 2 years ago, and this goes to what you were saying about having Marshall Yanda, about having Ronnie Stanley. Don't forget, not just those two. You don't have Orlando Brown at right tackle, who, say what you want about him as a left tackle, it's a Pro Bowl right tackle for a couple years. So, you're missing. Well,
you wonder why you're in 2nd and 2 all night.
Sure, but 2 years ago they went empty quite a bit. As much as we talked about, this running game that ran for 3,000 yards, they were in empty formations and they killed it in empty formations 2 years ago. Ever since, empty formations have been a disaster for them, and they just haven't had much success at all. I don't think it's all about Lamar Jackson suddenly can't operate out of a 5-man protection, anything like that, or a 5-man route. I think it just comes down to pass protection's not good enough. It was good enough in empty 2 years ago. It wasn't last year, and it hasn't been this year. So right off the bat, right there, when you're in positions where you're basically saying we need to have 6 or 7 guys protecting the pocket, it does limit what you can do offensively then throwing the ball through the air when you only have, as opposed to 5 men on a route, you only have 3 or 4 at most. So it's just the way that Greg Roman called that game on Thursday night. And I'm not going to say Greg Roman was right in doing this. I'm just saying, based on what we saw, very much reflected a lack of confidence in an offensive line. The way that the Dolphins were blitzing and the way that the Ravens were not taking shots down the field. And they just didn't have the confidence that the offensive line could hold up. So instead, you saw these wide receiver screens, which we saw work on a couple occasions last week, and we talked about that. And they went to the well quite a bit on Thursday night in that regard, and it didn't work out. So, I mean, it really, It's one of those deals where you look at this and you start looking ahead, and you know who Cleveland has coming off the edge and what their defensive line looks like. You know what Pittsburgh has with their defensive line. You know what the LA Rams have with their defensive line, now adding Von Miller to the mix recently. I mean, we saw Cincinnati have some success with what they did defensively. Now we'll see if that happens again when the Ravens go there the day after Christmas. But
the TJ Watts of the world are coming in.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you have some fronts that aren't just going to be good at, someone that exploits a weakness. These are strengths in isolation. These are our defensive fronts that are good against anybody, let alone talking about an undermanned offensive line. So,
by the way, I got Ryan Shazier booked on the show in a couple of weeks.
Cool.
So we're going to have him on before the Steelers game, so we'll be able to talk about Steelers, Ravens, and rushing the quarterback and all of that. Luke Jones is here. He will be out in Owings Mills after a little respite here this weekend. Terps basketball, Maryland, we're all behind you. I got Sean Merriman was on the program, too. You can find that at Baltimore Positive, collecting coach the other night and talking about Lamar. We're picking up the pieces of the aftermath. The Maryland Lottery will be presenting our Maryland Crab Cake Tour, and I'm going to have a crab cake to make myself feel better on Friday at Nick's. We're going to be at the Grandstand Grill in Timonium on Friday afternoon. Next week on Wednesday, we're with our Mayor Brandon Scott as well as Senator Corey McRae. I think cartoonist Mike Resigliano might be joining us as well, and some of our friends from Coppin. I don't know who's coming from Coppin. We're going to have some Coppin reps on Wednesday over in Lauraville at Coco. So I'm crab caking up, man. I had me a really, really tasty one on Wednesday down at Fadley's. I actually snuck out of there so quickly I left one behind. So I am owed a Fadley's crab cake. I got one sort of waiting for me, and some mac and cheese as well. So big thanks to Damie. Don Moeller, of course, he and I did the recon. We opened a new elementary school. Luke, I know you taught when I found you were elementary schooling and teaching and whatnot. We have the new school. So Bill Cole and I've talked about that. Don Moeller and I are going to continue to talk about that over in the east side of town. So something near and dear to your heart. The only thing you love more than the Ravens and the Orioles is education. So I figured I'd throw that out there. So man, these kids with pretty libraries now, and like it's like going back to school, but not like going back to school. Felt a little like Rodney Dangerfield. Dude, anything we can do to not talk about this game anymore? Can we meander back into bitching about ownership, or Stan Kroenke offering St. Louis $100 million and them saying, nah, we'll just take a team, we'll continue to go after you. There's all sorts of things, but sitting on the couch on Sunday, we'll be able to exhale a little bit, watch a little bit more of this. But the question then comes, I guess the old line is, will the real Ravens please stand up, right? And I don't think this odiferous version of Thursday night's the real version in one way. I've seen them go out and play well. But to your point, these trends, not starting well, defense is doing all sorts of things to at least slow them down, frustrate them. Nobody's getting blown out. Nobody is on skates backwards anymore early in games. And oh my God, Lamar left, Lamar right. He threw it over my head. He ran it in front of me. He broke my ankles. That's slowing down. So we're starting to see this curve that we talked about 2 years ago of, oh my God, they're in 2nd and 1 all night. I've never seen anything like it. That's stopping. Even on 3 days rest, teams are gearing up for them. The Bears are already preparing for them and saying, hey, do you see what the Dolphins did? Look at what the Bengals did. Look at what the Chargers didn't do. And you start to get this tape. Look what the Colts did for 3 quarters against them. Look at what the Raiders did before Chucky got fired. There's a lot of tape on stopping Lamar now, other than, hey, the Chargers are going to come in with a bunch of athletes and run around, right?
Yeah, and I don't think it's even so much a tape on stopping Lamar. It's just stopping the Ravens. We've talked about the injuries, and they're there. And look, we started our conversation as we were breaking this down as me basically saying, I don't want to hear about the Thursday night stuff. But the injuries are there. It doesn't mean you pack up and go home and say, well, it's just not our year. But this is a much more vulnerable team. And I even wrote about it a little bit at BaltimorePositive.com this week. Look, I fully expected a Ravens win. I picked the Ravens win by 2 touchdowns on Thursday night, so I'm not going to pretend to say that I had some kind of strange, suspicious feeling about how they were going to fare against the Dolphins. But, you do look at this team, 2019, had the highest point differential the NFL had seen since the 2007 Patriots. Those undefeated Patriots that lost in the Super Bowl to the Giants. Last year, despite the November that they had the highest point differential in the NFL, second straight year. They were blowing teams out. And it's not that it was every week, but you often saw 2 years ago, 59-10, they beat the Dolphins. And I know, teams are different. I'm not saying it's the exact same team, but you're just not seeing those performances. And you look at the Ravens now, they're 6-3. Their point differential, Nestor, plus 14. That tells you, if you're going off of that and you try to use point differential and some of those nerdy stats that guys like me try to look at as far as what can be predictors, that tells you this team kind of plays more like a 500 team in that way, in the sense that you kind of look at how their scores profile. Go down the schedule: 6-point loss to the Raiders, 1-point win over the Chiefs, 2-point win over the Lions that needed a record field goal to avoid losing to a winless team. Hey, they handled the Broncos. Nothing to complain about there. 6-point win over the Colts. Okay, they beat up on the Chargers, a 1:00 game, and whatever you want to make of that. They played very well. Then they got their butts kicked by the Bengals. Then you come out of the bye. You're thinking, okay, John Harbaugh's team coming out of the bye, rested. We know the history there. Well, we saw them sleepwalk early in that game, and they needed a double-digit comeback in the second half. 3-point game. Well, then you go to Miami against a lousy Dolphins team that had won 2 games all year and played lousy football.
By the way, it reminded me a little bit in the middle, and look, this is the first time in the history of the franchise that I've missed the Dolphins-Ravens game, right? I haven't missed a whole lot of games in the history of the franchise, but like this particular trip into that parking lot and what that represented when Nick Saban was there, the night they put Marino into their Hall of Fame, and it was a swamp down there, and I'm on the infield with Michael McCrary, and the mud's this thick, I go back to all of these events. But then you and I remember winning a wild card game down there, playoff game, like all of that, all of the trips down there. I remember the Orange Bowl with Friedgen because they were celebrating that season last week. I saw Fridge putting pictures up and all. I'm like, I was down there tonight, Florida, kicked their ass. I lost a bet to Travis Taylor. I had to wear his Gators helmet for a show out at the Barn. I got pictures of that. Me in a Gators hat. JR likes that, by the way. The Stover missed field goal, the bad team, the winless team, the Cam Cameron Dolphins team. As I'm wearing my Coons Ford shirt, that, by the way, this is Oilers blue. This is not aquamarine, just so you know. Lansdowne blue is what I would call it, sky blue. That was the end of Billick, right? Our partner on behalf of the Living Classrooms Foundation, that particular night, we remember these breakdowns against really bad teams. It kind of spooked me out a little bit in the third quarter because I was playing through my mind. I've seen a couple of Super Bowls at that stadium. I've seen Roger Clemens pitch World Series games and walk off the field in that stadium with light bulbs. I've had moments in that stadium. It harkened me back to the dark moments of, this is really a stinker, and if I was sitting in the upper deck down there right now and thinking about the beach tomorrow, and it's been cloudy, by the way, but the stone crabs are running nice. I think there's something about going to South Florida. They call it the South Beach flu is what they call it. I said they didn't get in early enough for all that. This is the 4-day flu, but I think there is something about going down there. It's 80 degrees. It's muggy. Lamar's home. Hollywood's home. There's extra buzz for them and all that. And then you get out there. You got no legs. Nobody's blocking. You played football 3 days ago. You played an extra quarter. Like all of that conspired for the Ravens to go down there in that awful Cameron game. It just reminded me of that.
Yeah, I would remind you the Dolphins also played on a short week too. But you're right. And look, I think all of those things can become a factor if you let it. And I think that's where the Ravens, that's where you could kind of say the Ravens are guilty of that. They started poorly. And it's funny. I hear on a weekly basis from Ravens, and this isn't a Ravens exclusive thing. This is every fan base. But you hear that their team doesn't get respect. They don't get love from the national media. I watched the NFL Network's pregame coverage from, 3 o'clock on. My goodness, you would not even know the Dolphins were playing.
Yeah, it was a love fest.
It was an absolute love fest. And look, I understand that. The Ravens are 6-2. The Dolphins were 2-7? It should have been a Ravens love fest, but the analysts, the talking heads were all talking about the Ravens being the best team in the AFC, and they were saying, okay, Tennessee's ahead of them technically, but they just lost Derrick Henry, and I mean, it was a complete love fest. And, a lot of that had to do with, Lamar coming home and Marquise Brown coming home. And look, we all remember what happened 2 years ago. I mean,
It was fun. I was there.
Yeah. And remember that game 2 years ago was really the start of this. We remember late 2018, the Ravens kind of played that bumper
We didn't know if it was for real.
Right,
yeah.
right. Whereas Lamar comes out and throws 5 touchdowns, and they had 42 points or whatever it was at halftime. It was absurd. 49 points, I think it was at halftime. And you're just thinking, what is this?
I was getting ready to say, you know what I remember about that? I remember meeting all of my friends from South Florida behind the press box at halftime, and the game was over, and it was like, hey, it's good to see you guys. It was fun. I do. And it was September. It was 100 degrees. It was all of that, right?
Right. But I think and John would never say this. The players would never admit to this, but you do wonder if there was a sense of, this felt a little bit like a homecoming game. Not that, you think of homecoming, it'd be in Baltimore, of course, but I mean for Lamar, for Marquise Brown.
You're going to roll the ball out and win 34-7.
Yeah, right? You're going to have fun. It's a featured game on prime time, and everyone's going to be talking about you all weekend. Wow, did you see the Ravens beat the Dolphins by 4 touchdowns or 40 points or, whatever it would have been in your head. But so you mentioned that. The game that I thought of a little bit more, now it wasn't Miami, but it was Florida. I thought of the 2011 Monday night game in Jacksonville, where Ray Rice only carried the ball 6 times or whatever it was. And the Ravens lose, was it 12-7 or something like that? I mean, it was just an absolutely dreadful football game. It was terrible to watch, which, by the way, that's another part of this. Just what a awful football game to watch, other than Robert Hunt doing his lineman, inexplicable, fat guy touchdown that, obviously gets called back, and, an offensive lineman inexplicably catching a screen pass. It just wasn't a very entertaining game, other than that, and just a couple other weird things happening. But I think, it did remind me a lot of the 2011 game, and that's a credit to John Harbaugh. In the sense, I'm not going to praise him right in the moment, but these types of performances have been very rare in the John Harbaugh era. Again, you lose games to good teams on the road. That's going to happen. They've lost plenty of road games to at least decent opponents, but losing games to bad teams, which is what the Miami Dolphins are. They are a bad football team. That hasn't happened very often over the Harbaugh era. So that's why it's so jarring. But again, you go back to some of these trends that we've seen, the process of 60 minutes. This team's got work to do, because it's not going to get any easier. And you show up against a Cleveland, at Pittsburgh, Green Bay, LA, or going back to Cincinnati to play the Bengals again, and you play like this, you'll get your butts kicked. It's not going to be a 12-point game. You'll lose by 4 touchdowns. So they've got work to do, and it doesn't mean you panic, but all right, you were 6-2, great, but hey, you got some issues. You got some issues on both sides of the ball, and you can keep saying, Lamar does a Superman thing, or you can say, we need to get better. Well, we can't rely on that every week, because Thursday night was a perfect example that you can't rely on it every week. It's not going to work out for you, and you're going to get your feelings hurt.
He's Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke. He'll be out in Owings Mills. All of our Ravens coverage brought to you by our friends at Royal Farms. Real fresh, real fast. Our friends at Coons Ford also providing that WNST tech service. Dennis took a little bye week this week and said bye-bye, went down to the Dolphins game. I'm sure he's sorry he went to the game. Probably should have been out on the Everglades on Thursday night on one of those airboats. I skipped the Miami trip. I am headed to Chicago next week. We got full coverage ahead. Maryland Crab Cake Tour doing double duty this week. Wednesday we were at Fadley's delicious crab cake there. Great conversations. On Friday, we will be at Nick's Grandstand Grill in Timonium. Then next Wednesday, the 17th, at Coco's, early in the day, doing a lunch turn there with our Mayor Brandon Scott, as well as Senator Corey McRae. My dear friend Mike Rosigliano will be there. And I got friends from Chicago, Illinois coming on to talk about the casserole that they call pizza out there all week, so I'll be heading to Chicago. I am Nestor. We are WNST, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore. We never stop talking. Baltimore, positive.